Story 1. I didn't want to camp there. Something about the place felt wrong the moment we pulled off the dirt road. But it was late, and my boyfriend Chris figured we might as well stay since we'd driven hours to escape the city. It was July 2016, and we were in eastern Pennsylvania, miles away from cell service or civilization. Primitive camping, just us, the car, and the woods. It should have been peaceful. It wasn't. The first red flag came about 30 minutes after we parked. We'd picked a spot by a clearing, muddy from the rain but drier than most places we'd passed. Chris was setting up the fire pit when I noticed a truck idling just up the road. A woman stood next to it. The hood popped open like she was waiting for help. Normally, Chris would have offered. He's that kind of guy. But he hesitated. "She's not really looking at us," he murmured, keeping his eyes on her. "People who need help usually, they try to make eye contact, wave you down. She looks like she's just waiting." I glanced her way, but I didn't see anything strange. Still, Chris didn't want to stop, so we drove past, leaving her standing by the truck, her face unreadable. We finally found a dryish spot around 6 p.m. The rain had let up, and Chris was in better spirits. He got the fire going, and we roasted some hot dogs, laughing and goofing off, like we always did on camping trips. But then, the car came. The same car passed us 3 times within an hour. Chris noticed it first, a beat-up sedan moving slowly down the dirt road. The driver's face turned toward us each time. It felt deliberate. On the third pass, Chris leaned toward me and whispered, "I think he's watching us." I tried to brush it off. Maybe he's just looking for a campsite, like we were. Chris didn't look convinced, but the car didn't come back again, so we stayed put. I wish we hadn't. We turned in around 11 p.m., the fire reduced to embers. I felt uneasy, but Chris assured me we were fine. He always knew how to calm me down. "There's no one out here but us," he said, squeezing my hand as we zipped up the tent. "And if there is, I'll protect you. Promise." Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise, a low mechanical sound that made my stomach twist. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again, louder this time, like metal grinding on gravel. Chris shot up beside me, his eyes wide. "What is that?" I whispered. "Stay quiet," he said, peeking out the tiny window. His face was tense, but he didn't say anything. The sound came again, closer now, a grinding, revving noise that echoed through the woods. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Chris whispered, "It's probably far off. Just go back to sleep." I wanted to believe him, but something about the way he whispered, like he was trying not to be heard, made my chest tighten. If the sound was far away, why would he whisper? We lay there in silence, listening. Every little rustle outside the tent made my skin crawl. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, footsteps. At least that's what it sounded like to me. After what felt like hours, Chris sat up and said, "Get dressed. We're leaving." "What? Why?" I asked, panic rising in my voice. "Just do it," he said, grabbing the machete we'd bought for the trip. He unwrapped it from its plastic, the sound of the blade slipping free sending shivers down my spine. We packed in record time, shoving everything into the car without a word. I kept glancing around, the moonlight casting eerie shadows through the trees. As Chris loaded the last bag, I noticed something by the fire pit, a beer can. We hadn't brought beer. "Chris," I whispered, pointing to it, "that wasn't there before." He froze, his eyes darting toward the can. "Get in the car," he said, his voice low and urgent. I didn't argue. We drove out of there as fast as the muddy road would allow, the car slipping and sliding as Chris gripped the wheel with white knuckles. I kept looking behind us, expecting to see headlights or worse. Someone standing in the road, but there was nothing, just darkness. Chris didn't say much during the drive home. It wasn't until we were safe, back in our apartment, that he finally admitted what he'd been thinking. "That sound," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "It wasn't far away. It was close, just down the road." I stared at him, my heart racing. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked away. "Because I didn't want to scare you. I still don't know what we heard that night, or who left that beer can by our fire. But one thing's for sure, I'll never go camping in those woods again." Story 2. I grew up in a little town tucked into the Appalachian foothills, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the woods are as much a part of life as the air you breathe. By the time I was 18, I'd already spent more time in those trees than I had in front of a TV. So, when I joined the local Scouts equivalent as an adult, I thought I had a handle on the three-feather challenge. I was wrong. My third day came after a full day of silence and another surviving on nothing but water. The final task? A night alone in the deepest part of the forest. No tents, no fire, just a tarp and a knife. Find your way back to camp unseen by dawn. The challenge was tradition, and I was cocky. After all, how hard could it be? I walked deeper into the woods than I ever had, wanting to prove I could handle it. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches twisting into shapes that looked almost alive in the fading sunlight. By the time I found a spot to settle, the underbrush was so thick I could barely see the ground. Night came fast, and with it, the heavy silence of the wilderness. I wasn't scared, at least not yet. The sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle in the brush kept me company. I dozed off under the tarp, knife in hand, feeling more annoyed by the mosquitoes than anything else. Then I woke up. It wasn't the kind of jolt you get from a bad dream or the snap of a twig nearby. No, this was different. My eyes opened and I felt it. Something was watching me. I lay still, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I scanned the darkness, but the forest seemed the same, just shadows and shapes. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like the air around me had changed, charged with something I couldn't explain. That's when I heard it, a low, wet gurgle. Not an animal, not anything I'd ever heard before. It came from somewhere to my left, where the trees were thicker, the ground softer. My first thought was that it might be a wild boar or a bear, but this sound, it was wrong. Too human, and at the same time, not human at all. I gripped my knife tighter, debating whether to stay put or investigate. Common sense told me to stay. Curiosity, and maybe a bit of pride, told me to go. I chose wrong. The sound came again, louder this time, like something was choking on mud. I crept toward it, stepping as lightly as I could. The moonlight barely filtered through the canopy, but my eyes adjusted enough to make out a trail. A faint, trampled path leading down into a hollow. The air smelled foul, like rot and damp earth. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I followed the path, the gurgling growing louder with every step. When I reached the hollow, I saw it, or rather I saw them. At first I thought it was a group of men. They stood in a circle, their backs to me, their heads bowed. But something was off. They didn't move, didn't make a sound beyond that awful, wet noise. Their skin looked pale, almost gray, like they'd been carved from ash and left to harden. And their proportions. They weren't right. Their arms were too long, their necks bent at unnatural angles. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Were they hunters? Number too quiet, too still. I couldn't even hear them breathe. Then, as if they sensed me, they all turned at once. Their faces, if you could call them that, were blank, smooth like melted wax, with no eyes, no mouths, just voids where features should have been. But the worst part? They moved. Not like people, not even like animals. It was jerky, stilted, like broken marionettes being yanked on invisible strings. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I ran. I didn't stop to think about where I was going. The woods became a blur of black and green as branches tore at my clothes and scratched my skin. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get away, to put as much distance between me and those things as possible. The gurgling followed me, closer now, and then I heard them. Footsteps. Fast. Too fast. They weren't chasing me. They were catching up. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. But I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of the campfire in the distance. I dove into the clearing, half expecting those things to burst through the trees after me. But they didn't. When I finally turned around, the forest was silent again. Too silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the crackle of the fire and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I never told anyone what happened that night. I don't even know if they'd believe me. Maybe it was exhaustion, dehydration, or my mind playing tricks after days of isolation. But every now and then, I catch myself listening, straining to hear that gurgling noise in the dark. And when I do, I make damn sure I'm not alone. Story 3. I don't scare easy. Growing up in a small Montana town, you learn to deal with the wilderness, unpredictable weather, bears, even the occasional mountain lion. So when my cousin, who works with the Forest Service, invited me to join her for a hydrology trip deep into the backcountry, I jumped at the chance. A couple nights camping in the wild, just the two of us, sounded like paradise. It started great. That first night, the stars were so clear, it felt like you could pluck them from the sky. The kind of experience that makes you feel tiny and infinite at the same time. We packed light, just our horses, some saddlebags, and basic supplies. But it was more than enough. By the second day, I was completely relaxed, soaking in the fresh air and scenery. That's when my cousin dropped it. "Hey, you want to see something weird?" The way she said it caught me off guard. Half joking, half serious. Naturally, I said yes. Curiosity's a killer like that. She veered our horses off the main trail into this little ravine. We went deeper and deeper until it felt like the woods were closing in on us, the sunlight barely trickling through the dense canopy above. After a couple of hours, we came to a clearing. She got off her horse and motioned for me to do the same. "Leave the horses here," she said, tying hers to a low branch. "We've got to walk the rest of the way." "Where are we going?" I asked, but she just smiled and told me to grab the little rechargeable radio we'd packed. "You'll see." We followed a narrow wildlife path, ducking under branches and stepping over roots, until suddenly she stopped. I almost bumped into her. She pointed to the ground ahead and said, "Check this out." At first I didn't see it, just dirt and leaves. But then, poking out of the earth was a wire. A thin black wire, the kind you'd use in a house for basic electrical work. It didn't make sense. We were miles from civilization. No cabins, no roads, nothing. "What the hell?" I muttered. She grinned, clearly enjoying my confusion. "Follow it," she said, so I did. The wire ran along the ground, snaking through the underbrush, before climbing up into the branches of a tree. From there, it zigzagged, up, down, wrapping around rocks, looping through more trees. It didn't seem to have any rhyme or reason, just a random, aimless path through the forest. My cousin stayed a few steps behind me, letting me lead. Eventually, the wire brought us to the strangest thing I've ever seen. In the middle of a small clearing stood an old metal desk, the kind you'd see in a school or an office decades ago, with a flimsy wood-patterned top and rusted legs. And mounted on the side of it, an electrical outlet, just 2 sockets, plain as day. I stared at it, my brain trying to process what I was looking at. It didn't make sense. "What is this?" I asked, but my cousin just shrugged. "No idea. Found it a couple years back. Thought you'd get a kick out of it." I walked closer, half expecting the desk to vanish like some mirage. But it was real, solid. The wire we'd been following was connected to the outlet. And the crazy part? It wasn't dead. "Plug in the radio," my cousin said, holding it out to me. "You're joking." "Just do it." I hesitated, then took the radio. The cord felt heavier in my hand than it should have, like my body was resisting what I was about to do. I knelt down, plugged it in, and the thing lit up instantly. Static crackled through the speaker, loud and sharp. I yanked the cord out, my hands shaking. "Okay, that's not possible." "I know," she said, her voice quieter now. "There's no power lines out here. Nothing. But somehow, it works." I looked around the clearing, half expecting to see hidden cameras or some prank setup. But there was nothing, just trees and silence, and that goddamn desk. "Have you tried following the wire back?" I asked. She nodded. "Yeah, it goes underground about a mile from here. Couldn't figure out where it leads." We stood there for a moment, neither of us saying anything. The forest felt different now, heavier somehow, like it was watching us. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I turned my back on the desk, something would happen. "Let's go," my cousin said finally, breaking the spell. We made our way back to the horses in silence. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something following us, but the path stayed empty, the forest eerily still. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that desk, the outlet, the wire disappearing into the dirt. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who put it there? Why? And most importantly, where was the power coming from? I never went back to that spot. Story 4. I'll never forget that hike in Andorra. My friend Jake and I were looking for an adventure. Not a haunting. It was supposed to be simple. Just a couple of days trekking through breathtaking landscapes. No guide, no map. A little reckless, sure, but that's how we liked it. We had no idea it would leave us questioning reality. We lost the trail on day 2. One minute we were following markers, chatting away, and the next everything looked foreign. It wasn't gradual either. It was like the forest decided we didn't belong and swallowed us whole. By the time we realized we'd crossed into Spain, panic started to creep in. No service on our phones, no idea where we were, and the sun sinking lower by the minute. That's when we spotted him. A young man, maybe in his late 20s, with 2 golden retrievers trotting happily beside him. He was walking ahead of us on the trail, carrying climbing gear slung over one shoulder. Relief washed over us like a wave. Someone who knew the area. We picked up the pace, practically jogging to catch up with him. He turned as we approached, his expression calm and friendly. The dogs ran circles around us, tails wagging, making the tension ease just a bit. I remember every word he said, probably because I replayed them 1,000 times in my head afterward. "You're way off the trail," he said, chuckling. His accent was light. Spanish, I think, but his English was flawless. "There's a town about 12 kilometers from here. If you want to stop sooner, there's a smaller town only 6 kilometers away. That's where my car's parked. I can give you a ride if you'd like. I'll be heading there anyway." We could have hugged him. Jake asked a dozen questions, and the guy answered them all without hesitation. He seemed like one of those people who belonged outdoors, the kind you envy for their confidence and easy demeanor. Even his dogs had a kind of calm energy about them, like they knew the woods as well as he did. We hiked together for a while, but Jake and I couldn't keep up. The guy was fit, way fitter than us, and his stride ate up the trail like it was nothing. "Catch up when you can," he called over his shoulder before disappearing around a bend. The dogs followed, tails wagging. That's when it got weird. We rounded the bend maybe 2 minutes later, expecting to see him up ahead. But the trail was empty. It stretched in a straight line for at least 1/4 of a kilometer, wide enough that there was no way he or the dogs could have gone off into the trees without us seeing. We stopped, scanned the area, and called out. Nothing. "Maybe he's hiding?" Jake suggested, half joking. The idea didn't sit right, though. Why would he hide? And how could he vanish so quickly? The forest had turned eerily silent. Not even the usual rustle of leaves or distant bird calls. Just the sound of our own breathing. We kept walking, our pace slower now, every step feeling heavier than the last. My gut told me something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. We'd both seen him, we'd both heard him. So where the hell did he go? The sun was almost gone by the time we reached the smaller town he'd mentioned. It was tiny, just a handful of buildings and a main road, but no sign of him or his car. We didn't linger, just kept moving toward the larger town he'd said was farther down the trail. When we finally reached the hotel, we were too exhausted to talk about what had happened. But lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't been alone. I kept thinking about those dogs, their tails wagging, running circles around us. Friendly, too friendly. Jake and I talked about it the next morning, and we both agreed on one thing. There was no logical explanation for his disappearance. He couldn't have moved that fast. He couldn't have left the trail without us seeing. It wasn't just strange, it was impossible. We haven't gone back to Andorra since. Sometimes I wonder if we imagined him, if the stress of being lost played tricks on our minds. But then I remember the dogs, the climbing gear, the way he laughed when he said we were off the trail. And I know he was real, or at least he seemed real. Story 5. The desert has a way of swallowing things, sounds, objects, even people. I've been working as a ranger in one of the most isolated desert parks in the Southwest for a few years now, and I've learned this lesson the hard way. People come to these parts looking for solitude, for answers, for something the crowded world can't give them. Sometimes, though, they find more than they bargained for. This story didn't happen to me directly, but to the rangers I replaced. We don't talk about it much, not because we're sworn to secrecy or anything, but because the whole thing lingers like a bad taste in the back of your throat. The kind of story that doesn't feel right to bring up over beers or around a campfire. It happened a few summers ago during our off-season. In the blistering heat of July, when visitors were scarce and the heat could melt the resolve of the toughest hikers, the maintenance ranger went out on a routine patrol. It was a seldom-used campground, a cluster of sites carved into the sands and shrubs miles from the nearest paved road. It wasn't uncommon for the sites to sit empty for months, save for the odd RV or lone camper passing through. I can't imagine what he must have felt when he spotted the car. It was sitting in one of the furthest sites, half hidden by scrub and cactus. The thing was gutted, burnt so badly that it looked more like a twisted hunk of metal than a vehicle. He approached cautiously, probably assuming it was some abandoned wreck left by joyriders or vandals. In this part of the desert, you get a lot of that. Folks who think they can run away from something, leaving their mess behind when reality catches up. But this was different. As he got closer, the smell hit him. It wasn't just the acrid scent of burnt rubber and metal. It was something deeper, more sickly. The maintenance ranger stopped dead in his tracks. Even now, when I ask him about it, he refuses to describe it in detail. He says there are some smells that you can't ever wash out of your memory no matter how much time passes. He backed away and radioed it in immediately, just as protocol demands. "There's something out here. You better call the sheriff." That's all he said. The sheriff arrived about an hour later, and the two of them stood there for a moment, staring at the wreck like it might spring to life and bite them. When the sheriff finally approached, flashlight in hand, the ranger couldn't bring himself to follow. The sheriff circled the car once, twice, then stopped at the driver's side door. He leaned in, muttered something under his breath, and stepped back sharply, hand on his sidearm. "Stay where you are," the sheriff told him, his voice low and steady. The kind of tone that makes you feel like you've just wandered into a place you shouldn't be. "What is it?" the ranger asked, but the sheriff didn't answer right away. He just stared at the car, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. Finally, he gestured for the ranger to come closer. "You're gonna want to see this." The ranger hesitated, but his curiosity got the better of him. He stepped closer, careful not to touch the car, and peered inside. What he saw, well, it's the sort of thing that changes a person. Sitting in the driver's seat was a body, or what was left of one. It was burnt beyond recognition, little more than a charred torso and head. No arms, no legs. Just a husk, slumped over like some grotesque scarecrow. The interior of the car was blackened and warped from the heat, the windows shattered, the steering wheel melted to the point where it looked like it had been smeared across the dashboard. The ranger said he felt like he couldn't breathe. The desert heat, the smell, the sight of that body. It pressed down on him, heavy as a tombstone. He stumbled back, gagging, and had to sit down on the dusty ground to keep from passing out. The sheriff, to his credit, kept his composure. He radioed for backup, then started snapping photos and jotting down notes. The ranger asked if it could have been an accident, if maybe the driver had fallen asleep and the car caught fire. The sheriff just shook his head. "Doesn't add up," he said. "Fire didn't start from the engine. Looks like it came from inside the car." They stayed there until the forensic team arrived, watching the sun sink lower and lower into the horizon. The desert turned cool and quiet, the shadows stretching long and thin. The ranger told me later that he couldn't stop looking at the body, even when he tried. Something about it just drew his eyes back, like he was trying to piece together a puzzle that refused to be solved. The investigation didn't turn up much. No ID, no personal belongings, no sign of what caused the fire or who the victim might have been. The car had no plates and the VIN was scratched off, leaving no way to trace it. The forensic team determined that the fire had burned hot and fast, consuming everything in its path. But as for how or why it started, they couldn't say. The desert, like I said, has a way of swallowing things. Evidence, stories, people. The burned-out car was towed away a few days later, but the site never felt the same. The other rangers avoid it now, claiming it gives them the creeps. Some say they've seen things out there. Shadows moving where there shouldn't be, whispers carried on the wind. Me? I don't put much stock in ghost stories, but I haven't been back to that campground since I heard the tale. Some mysteries, I think, are better left unsolved. Story 6. I worked as a ranger for a few years in the rugged backcountry of Colorado. It was one of those jobs that could be as calm as an empty horizon or as hectic as a wildfire. Most of the time, you were just making sure folks followed basic rules. Don't litter, keep your fires small, and for God's sake, don't do anything dumb that'll get you killed. But every once in a while, you'd get groups like these guys. They were frat boys, rowdy, loud, and exactly the kind of campers who think a good time means disturbing everyone within a 3-mile radius. They'd set up at a popular spot just off a trailhead, far enough from the station that we couldn't keep a constant eye on them, but close enough to hear their racket echoing off the cliffs. The first time we swung by their site, it was all slurred laughs, booming music, and empty beer cans scattered like confetti. I told them to tone it down. My buddy Jim, another ranger, added that the noise wasn't just annoying, it could also attract predators. "You boys ever hear of ghost cats?" Jim asked. He had a knack for storytelling, and I could see the wheels in his head turning. "Mountain lions. They're quiet as death, but when you're loud, they know right where to find you." The frat boys laughed it off, cracked open more beers, and promised to keep it down. We left, but I knew we'd be back. Sure enough, an hour later, we were called out again. This time they were even worse, hooting, hollering, and blasting music. I was out of patience, and Jim had an idea. He told them, with the gravitas of someone delivering a funeral speech, "This is your last warning. Mountain lions around here. They love noise at night. They creep in, silent as ghosts. If you hear anything, don't leave your tent. And whatever you do, don't make a sound." They all went quiet, but I wasn't sure if it was fear or amusement. Either way, we left and drove back to the station. That's when Jim turned to me and grinned. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" I shook my head. "No way." But Jim had already started rummaging through the gear closet. He pulled out the lion pelt from the interpretation center, used for educational demos, and the old night vision goggles the head ranger had bought with leftover budget funds. By the time he was done, I was grinning too. We waited until their campsite went quiet. The frat boys finally tucked into their tents. Then we loaded up the Jeep and headed back. We parked a short distance away and crept into the site with all the stealth we could muster. The pelt was rigged up over some sticks to make it look as lifelike as possible. I admit it looked creepy as hell in the dark. Jim had brought the PA system, and from a safe distance, he started making fake mountain lion calls. Low, guttural growls that got louder and closer with every pass. Meanwhile, I pulled the Jeep forward, headlights off, and flicked on my mag light. I moved fast, sweeping the beam across the campsite, catching the silhouette of the lion as if it were stalking through the shadows. Because of the way I was moving, the shadow actually seemed to shift and sway, like the pelt was alive. That's when the screaming started. From inside their tents, the frat boys were losing it. Jim added to the chaos, shouting things like, "Stay in your tents!" and "Oh crap, there's another one." The final touch was his panicked yell, "Let's get the hell out of here!" I turned off the lights, grabbed the pelt in the cover of darkness, and we hightailed it out of there. The next morning, just after sunrise, we parked nearby and walked back to the campsite like nothing had happened. The place was dead silent. No music, no chatter, just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Eventually, the frat boys started poking their heads out of their tents, looking like they hadn't slept a wink. It wasn't until about 8:30 that anyone dared to leave their tent completely. When they saw the massive paw and claw prints we'd carefully stomped into the dirt, their faces went pale. They whispered among themselves, looking around like the lions might still be there. I swear one of them looked like he was about to cry. We acted casual, as if we had no idea why they were so spooked. "Everything all right here?" Jim asked, his voice dripping with innocence. The frat boys just nodded, packed up their gear in record time, and were gone before noon. To this day, I don't know if they ever figured out the truth. Part of me hopes they didn't. Maybe next time they're out in the wild, they'll think twice before making a racket. And who knows, maybe they'll keep one ear open for ghost cats, stalking silent as death. Story 7. I don't camp much anymore. I'd rather sleep at home and wake up to a world I can trust to make sense. But before this happened, I used to head out all the time, packing light and enjoying the solitude. The West Coast was my favorite. The dense forests, the rugged coastline, the wide open campgrounds. It was perfect, especially for someone like me with back issues. Instead of a tent, I'd sleep in my car, windows covered for privacy, the back seat converted into a makeshift bench with a sleeping bag. Comfortable enough. But one night changed everything. It started like any other trip. I arrived late to a campground, the kind of spot you'd barely find on a map, and parked away from the clusters of RVs and noisy families. I didn't want company, just peace and quiet. I set up my little routine, blocking the car windows, sliding into my sleeping bag, and letting the muffled sounds of the forest lull me to sleep. It wasn't silence, not exactly, but it was the kind of hum that made you feel safe. Leaves rustling, insects buzzing, the distant creak of wood. Then sometime before dawn, the sound ripped me out of my sleep. It wasn't just loud, it was strange, like a rumbling that I couldn't place. You know the sound when you're pushing a shopping cart over rough pavement, gravel rattling beneath the wheels? That's what it reminded me of. I lay there for a second, frozen, trying to convince myself it wasn't worth worrying about. But just as I started to relax, the car jolted. It wasn't a soft bump, like a branch brushing against the side. No, this was hard. The entire car shifted, rocking like someone had thrown their shoulder into it. My heart jumped into my throat. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to move. But the damn sleeping bag zipper was stuck. The inside zipper. It's supposed to be convenient, but all it did was trap me when I needed out. Panic set in. My fingers fumbled, yanking at the zipper, my breath coming fast and shallow. It felt like forever, but finally I managed to free myself enough to sit up. The car was still. Quiet again. Too quiet. I leaned forward, trying to peer through the cracks in the window covers, but they were too snug. I thought about pulling them down, but part of me didn't want to. What if there was something, someone out there, staring back at me? My skin prickled with the thought. Instead, I stayed inside, motionless, my ears straining for any hint of sound. Nothing. Not even the hum of the forest. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to open the door. The early morning air was cold against my face, but the clearing around me was empty. No people, no animals, no movement. Just the faint outline of the trees against the lightning sky. I stepped out barefoot and circled the car. At first, everything looked normal. No dents, no scratches, no sign of anything that could have hit me. But then I saw them. Marks, drag marks, streaked through the dirt, leading from the back of my car into the woods. They were deep, uneven, like something heavy had scraped its way across the ground. My pulse quickened as I followed them, one step at a time, each footfall crunching in the gravel. The trail ended abruptly, disappearing into a cluster of bushes. I pushed through the thickets, the leaves snagging my clothes, until I stepped into a small clearing. And there, barely visible in the faint light, was a hole. A pit dug deep and wide, the dirt piled haphazardly around the edges. It looked fresh, disturbed in the last few hours. I didn't stick around to find out what it meant. Every instinct I had screamed at me to get back to the car, and I listened. I ran, half stumbling, not even bothering to zip up my sleeping bag as I climbed back inside and locked the doors. The sun rose not long after, and with it came the comfort of daylight. But even as the campground came alive with the sounds of kids laughing and pots clanking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I packed up my gear and left without a word, driving straight home, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror the whole way. Story 8. I'll be honest, living on the edge of a national park sounded like a dream at first. Isolation, endless skies, and the freedom to breathe without city walls pressing in on you. But let me tell you, the middle of nowhere is only romantic until it isn't. And after what I experienced, I wouldn't go back even if you paid me. The cabin was basic. No plumbing, no power, no locks. Just 4 rickety walls and a roof. To get there, you had to drive 4 miles off the main road, bumping down a dirt trail through thick woods until the trees opened up into a clearing. It was remote enough that cell service was a myth, and the only company we had was whatever wildlife decided to wander through. My roommate, let's call him Ryan, was interning with the Park Service, but he was a city kid at heart. He thought the cabin was quaint. I thought it was an accident waiting to happen. The nights were the worst, the kind of pitch-black darkness where every sound feels amplified. At first, I chalked it up to the usual: wind rustling branches, animals moving through the brush. But then the footsteps started. I'm not talking about random scuffles or the soft crunch of leaves under a raccoon's paws. These were deliberate, slow, human. They'd start somewhere near the cabin, faint at first, like whoever or whatever it was wanted to stay just out of earshot. But they'd get closer. I'd hear them outside the window, pacing, stopping, pacing again, and then nothing. Silence, like they'd vanished into thin air. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the creak of wood shifting under the cold night air, maybe a stray pig or a mountain lion. But my gut told me otherwise. The cabin didn't have a locking door, not for lack of trying on my part. The owners wouldn't let me install one. Some nonsense about preserving the rustic charm. So, after a week of sleepless nights, I gave up and started sleeping in my car. It felt safer, even if it was parked over an acre away from the cabin. I thought distance would help. I thought the footsteps would stay behind, trapped in the shadows of the woods. But I was wrong. The first night in the car was uneventful, which gave me hope. By the second night, I started hearing them again. Faint at first, the same rhythm. One step, pause. Another step, pause. Closer. I locked the doors, gripping the steering wheel like that would somehow stop whatever was out there. The windows were fogged from my breath, and I couldn't see a thing beyond the street glass. My pulse was thundering in my ears, drowning out everything except those damn footsteps. And then, they stopped. Right by the car. I held my breath, waiting, listening. I thought I could hear something. A faint tapping, maybe a brush of fingers against the glass. But I didn't dare move. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time felt warped, like the night had stretched itself out just to torture me. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out of the car. The clearing was empty, the woods still and quiet. But the cabin was different. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside, not after what I saw. Around the cabin in the dirt were tracks, not animal tracks, human ones. Deep, uneven prints leading right up to the door and stopping there, as if whatever made them had just walked away into nothing. That was it for me. I packed my stuff that day and left. Ryan stayed behind, called me crazy, said I was overreacting. Maybe I was, or maybe I wasn't. Either way, I don't think he ever heard the footsteps. But me, I still do. Sometimes late at night, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear them. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. Story 9. I've been hiking, camping, and teaching outdoor survival skills for years, so I like to think I know my way around the wilderness. But back in 2010, I had an experience in the Colorado backcountry that still sends a shiver down my spine whenever I think about it. I just finished a wilderness leadership course and decided to treat myself to a few weeks of solo camping near some hot springs I'd heard about. They were only accessible during the winter when the Colorado River's water levels dropped low enough to uncover them. Perfect spot, right? Isolated, serene, and on BLM land, which meant no crowded campgrounds or screaming kids. It sounded like heaven on paper. When I arrived, the BLM ranger, a no-nonsense older lady, made me promise to mark the date on my car's windshield once a week, just so she'd know I was still alive. I laughed it off at the time, but looking back, her warning feels heavier. The hike from my car to my campsite was about 4 miles, through thick snow and trees that seemed to close in tighter the deeper I went. I set up my tent near a cliff, about 40 feet above the river. It wasn't an ideal spot, but I figured being near the edge gave me an escape plan if anything went wrong. My reasoning? If a bear found me, I could jump, hit the water, and swim to the hot springs to avoid hypothermia. Not exactly a brilliant plan, but in the wild, you cling to whatever scraps of logic you can muster. The days were peaceful, quiet, almost meditative. But nights out there, nights were different. The kind of darkness that swallows you whole. No glow from the city, no sounds of distant highways, just blackness and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I tried not to think about bears. They should have been hibernating, but if they weren't, well, a hungry bear in winter isn't something you want to meet. It was the fourth or fifth morning, just before dawn, when it happened. I woke up to a sound loud enough to snap me out of sleep. At first I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch breaking under the weight of snow. But then I heard it again, a heavy grunt, breathing, the kind of noise you feel in your gut more than your ears. I froze. The sounds got louder, closer. Whatever it was big. I could hear its steps crunching through the snow, slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I stayed perfectly still, not daring to even zip open my sleeping bag. The steps stopped, right outside my tent. I could hear it sniffing, a deep, wet inhale that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My mind raced. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? Something worse? I didn't have bear spray within reach. It was useless inside the tent anyway. And the idea of fumbling for my knife felt laughable. All I could do was lie there, heart hammering, as the sniffing went on and on. Then just as suddenly as it came, it moved away. I didn't relax though. The noises hadn't stopped completely. I could hear more movement now, more than one set of steps, circling the tent. My throat was dry, my body frozen in place. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I unzipped the sleeping bag as quietly as I could and poked my head out of the tent, heart in my throat. It wasn't a bear, it was a herd of elk. Relief and embarrassment flooded me all at once. There they were, probably 20 or 30 of them, their massive bodies outlined against the pale light of dawn. They were snorting and pawing at the snow, oblivious to the terror they'd just put me through. I sat there for a while watching them. The fear didn't fade completely. There was still something unsettling about how close they'd gotten, how silent they'd been until they weren't. The forest felt different after that, like it had a personality I couldn't quite pin down, like it was watching me. I stayed out there for another week but kept my campfire burning a little brighter at night. I told myself it was to keep warm, but the truth was I just didn't want to feel that kind of fear again. Looking back, it's almost funny. Elk. But in that moment, it was pure, unfiltered terror. And even now when I camp alone, I can't hear footsteps in the snow without my heart skipping a beat. Story 10. If you spend enough time in the woods, you get used to weird stuff happening. Shadows that seem to move, sounds that don't belong, that prickling feeling at the back of your neck when you realize you're not alone. But 9 times out of 10, it's easy to explain away. A bird startled, the wind shifted, your imagination ran wild. But sometimes it's not that simple. This happened years ago, back when I was a leader for a youth group, kind of like scouts. We were on a camping trip in an area we'd never used before. The terrain was massive, much larger than we were used to, and there hadn't been time to explore every inch before the kids arrived. Normally, we'd make sure to scout ahead, check for hazards, figure out the layout, but this time, we were flying blind. As always, the highlight of the trip was the night game. It's tradition, mask up, pretend to be monsters, hide in the woods, and scare the kids as they complete tasks at various checkpoints. It's all good fun, and the kids love it. But this year, the forest felt off. It wasn't just dark, it was the kind of dark that twists your vision and makes you see things that aren't there. The trees were close together, their shadows pooling like ink, and the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. I had stationed myself near an open stretch of forest, no foliage, barely any underbrush, just bare trunks stretching toward the sky. It was perfect for chasing the kids, but terrible for hiding, so I had to keep my flashlight off. I crouched behind one of the trees, waiting for the next group to come by, when I saw it, a shadow, about my height. It moved fast, darting between trees. I froze, my pulse quickening, but when I turned my flashlight on, there was nothing there, just empty space and darkness. I shook it off. Must have been my imagination, but I saw it again and again. It wasn't just moving now, it was standing, watching, near one of the trees not too far from me. At first I thought it was another leader playing along, trying to spook me. We were all masked up after all, so it wasn't like I'd recognize them right away. Still, something about the way it stood, the way it didn't move, made my stomach twist. I decided to go over, assuming it was time to head back to the campsite anyway. As I got closer, I noticed the figure was dressed, strangely. Torn burlap draped over its body like a sack, and its head was covered in what looked like white plastic bags tied together. I stopped in my tracks, dread flooding through me. Something was wrong. This wasn't normal. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything okay?" No response, just a faint sound, knocking, like someone tapping on wood. I stepped closer, my flashlight aimed at the ground. The knocking grew louder, more rhythmic. 10 meters away now, I finally saw it clearly. The figure wasn't tapping. It was banging its head against the tree. Repeatedly, hard enough that I could hear the impact echo through the forest. It was a man, barefoot, his arms and legs coated in crusted mud. His hands were twisted, clenched into unnatural shapes, and his breathing was shallow, almost raspy. "Knock it off," I said, more out of reflex than anything else. I was convinced it had to be one of the leaders messing with me. But then he turned his head, slowly, too slowly, and then he started walking toward me. Something inside me snapped. Every instinct screamed at me to run, and I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted, sprinting through the trees, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I heard him behind me, his footsteps pounding against the earth, gaining on me. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to risk seeing whatever expression was on his face, didn't want to lose my focus and slam into a tree. I hit the clearing and didn't stop until I reached the campsite. My chest was heaving, my legs burning, but I barely registered the pain. My eyes darted around, scanning the faces of the other leaders. They were all there, every single one of them. And none of them had time to change out of a burlap sack and mud before getting back to camp. That's when it hit me. Whatever or whoever I'd seen wasn't one of us. I didn't tell anyone that night. It felt pointless. They wouldn't believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed myself. But every time I think about it, I can still hear the knocking, still feel the heavy thud of footsteps behind me. It's the kind of memory that sticks, that refuses to let you sleep. I haven't been back to those woods since. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.